Hey everyone, it's Tonya Gibbs and welcome to our live broadcast today on Ustream. I want to share with you a couple of samples of the cards that I've been creating lately, and this one is the one we're going to work on tonight. And then sometime later in the month I'll try and do a YouTube video sharing how I created this one, but I really want the technique of how to do the sunflower in this class so that when we do this one, you guys are old pros. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll leave this one over to the side so you can see, and we'll bring this one back out later. For tonight's class, you're going to need some water. So I have some off to the side. You're going to need a paper towel or some sort of blotting cloth. So we have that. A couple of different paint brushes. I'm going to use a pencil too. But a couple of different paint brushes. You want a sort of thicker paintbrush that's watercolor. This is going to serve as like a mop to dump lots of water for our washes. Then we'll have a couple more that are just more of a detailed type brushes. So this one is a number 3 round brush, and this is a liner brush. So there's the brushes. And I just wanted to share with you guys a technique, a simple card technique. I like to practice on cards instead of journal pages sometimes, because when I'm done, if I really like it, I can always share it with someone, give it to a friend. So there's that is an option. I also have pulled out a little palette to put my watercolors in. Now I may not use this one because today I had this little stroke of genius, and I pulled out a old ice cube tray. So what I want to do is I'm going to use one side to put my pigments into, and then I'll use the other side as the wash. So we'll water it down a little more, or maybe mix our colors on the other side. And I think I have just a little more room in this than I would in that other palette. And I may have to go in and adjust my camera so it's not focusing in and out. But just as a reminder, these are readily available. These are made by Plaid. These are paintbrushes that I highly recommend for this techniques. So they come in as a package like this. I think they were like $6. And I'm not going to mention stores where you can purchase them, because I think if you see the brands, then you're pretty familiar with what's available in your area, and you should be able to find them anywhere. But it's a nice assortment of just round brushes, which are really great because you could use this one for the mopping. Although I do recommend one that's a little bit more of a natural bristle for the mopping technique. So that's why I have this. This is just it's like a hair brush. It's got hair, not nylon. Then I'm also going to use some watercolor paper today. And I've already pre-cut my watercolor paper to the sides of a card panel, which I keep mine, a standard A2 card size is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So I've actually cut these 1/4 of an inch smaller. So my panels are 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. Already pre-cut, so I don't have to worry about am I going too far. And again, these are going to be cards. And you know what's so cool about this is if it doesn't work out, if it goes in the trash, it's no big deal. So there's that. Now, as far as the watercolor paper that I'm using today, I'm using the Canson, watercolor paper. And this is a 9 by 12 pad, and it's 140 pound cold press durable surface. So there's the brand that I'm using today, and all I did was cut the papers down to the size that I needed. And when you cut them down, you're going to have a few strips left over. So like I had these strips left over. I kept these in my scrap pile because you may need to test a color or something like that. And then I also have these that are roughly 4 inches by 3 3/4 inches, and I thought these would be really cool to make a little mixed media book out of. So I I hang on to stuff like this, these little scraps like this, because you never know when they'll come in handy. Okay, so as far as the paint goes today, I'm going to be using these paints. These are watercolor paints by Simply. I think they are Daler Rowney. Now, these are watercolor. They come in a really nice set. There's 12 in the pack. They're sample size. I highly recommend, if you are a beginner, to start with something like this. They are a really nice set to just kind of start with. Now, if you're going to do some professional painting, obviously you might want to step up the pigment and get a really nice watercolor. But I think for beginners and for us to just get the feel of how things work, this is a fantastic beginner set. And I've had no problems with it at all. So anyway, so we have this set that we're going to use tonight. I'm going to go ahead and just take them out. Now I'm going to keep my palette somewhat simple because I want you guys to learn, if you can only buy a few colors of a very expensive paint, then I am going to recommend, let me see, which one of these did I open? I'm going to recommend just a few colors that's all you need. So if you can afford these 4 simple colors, you can make any color you want. So if you're going to buy an expensive watercolor tube of paint that has a really rich pigment in it, and this holds true for acrylics, anything, I would say my very first purchase would be a primary yellow, a primary blue, a primary red, and a burnt sienna. With these 4 colors you can make any color you choose. So that's my recommendation. So for now, because I'm going to be teaching you guys the techniques of how to mix colors properly, I am not going to worry about the greens that you have here. I'm going to show you how to make these greens. So we're going to put these to the side for now. I may come back and use some of this white to bring in some highlights, but I'm not planning on it. So I'm going to leave it where it's at and just pull these out. I've also got, this is my craft mat that I have wrapped around a cutting board. Love this idea, guys. This was awesome. I was going to throw this cutting board out, wrap my Timmy mat around it. This is the Ranger craft mat. It was the smartest idea I've ever had because I can pull it in and out as I need to. So with watercolor paper, it is different than traditional cardstock. Let's talk about the paper for just a second, because I know a lot of people who say they just can't watercolor. Well, a lot of times it's because they're not using the correct tools. Okay, so what I want to talk about is watercolor paper is sort of magical. Just think of it that way. The cool thing about the way watercolor paper is pressed is that when you add water to the paper, if any area of the paper is still dry, the pigment, when you add the pigment, will stay in the wet areas. So a lot of times people who struggle with watercoloring, they want to wet the whole thing, slap some pigment on, and then they can't understand why they have mud. So tonight I'm going to show you a few simple techniques for making sure that your colors don't bleed where you don't want them to. Now, with that said, watercolor has a mind of its own because it's fluid. Therefore, sometimes we have to work with some happy accidents. But I believe watercolor, the reason it is so popular is because it is very organic and very impressionistic. So sometimes it's the things that happen on the paper with the pigment that we work around that make the magic happen. So I hope that makes sense for everyone. So let me know as we work through this if I need to adjust anything. Like I'm not super happy with that light right there. I may pull this over to here. If you guys need me to change the angle of the camera at any point tonight, please let me know. And if it's focusing in and out too much, please let me know. Now, I do want to start out with a little bit of a disclaimer. I am not paid to do these classes by anyone who is affiliated with any of the products that you see here tonight. I am only telling you what I enjoy using and what I enjoy doing. I am not an expert in any way, but as you can see, you don't have to be an expert to make a beautiful card. And that's what I'm after tonight, is to teach you a few simple techniques for creating beautiful art that you can share with your friends and family. These are techniques that I have learned along the way. These are techniques that I've learned from other artists, and they're techniques that, sometimes it's just get in here and play. They work for me. They may not work for everyone, and a professional watercolor artist may tell you to do something different, and by all means do that. But this works for me. Okay? So does anybody have any questions about the supplies that we're using tonight before we get started? So while everyone's still kind of logging in, I'm going to go ahead and give a rough sketch onto this piece of paper. Now, I highly recommend, if you are not familiar with sunflowers, go to the internet, pull up a picture, and take a look at how the leaves fall. Because a lot of times these petals that you see coming in this way, the wind has pulled them over. They're very delicate. Gravity has pulled them this way. They reach towards the sun. So the petals typically come up around the bulb that you see here in the center. So while I'm going to start with a basic circle shape, I'm going to keep some of that circle open so that some of my petals can fall into the center of the bulb. Now, I'm using on watercolor paper, you have a textured side and you have a smooth side. I am going to use the texture side for today, and you won't be able to see the texture in the camera, I don't believe, but hopefully you'll be able to see what's going on. So for a rough sketch, I want the sunflower to be the majority of my card today. So I'm going to kind of come into about 2/3 of the card, and I'm going to draw a circle. And again, you're not going to be able to see it just yet. I'm going to try and get it. There we go. Let me see if I can get it dark enough to where it'll focus. So I have a little bit of a semicircle. And then I'm just going to roughly pull in some petal shapes just around the rest of that semicircle. Just imagine that it was bangs. And again, it's not going to be super dark where you guys can see it, but it is there. It's just a rough sketch. Then I'll try and draw it a little bit darker, but then I'm going to continue out, pulling out some of these petals, coming back up this way until I fill the card. Now I don't need to be exact, but I just giving a rough shape. Everybody knows how a sunflower's petals look. And I find that if I start out with a loose sketch until I become really familiar with what I'm doing, then I will be more likely to reserve space that I need to reserve for certain things. So I'm going to sketch out my leaf, which is going to be down in here. And I will hold this up after I get my rough sketch drawn so you guys can see it. Now remember that sunflowers usually have 2 or 3 rows of petals. And I don't necessarily have to sketch that out, but I find that if I go ahead and fill in those gaps and add those 3 layers, offsetting each layer between a series of petals, that I typically reserve that space and don't overwash the background. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to add one more row. And I'm not being terribly exact because, like I said, nothing in watercolor has to be perfect. It is sometimes just very impressionistic. But like I said, the more I can add these in now, the more likely I am to not cover up the negative space. And the more realistic and thick my sunflower will be. So now now I've drawn my lines a little bit darker here than I would normally draw them because I want you guys to see. If you can see, we've got this opening right here. This is where my petals are pulled forward. So imagine that coming around like that. Okay. So these are coming in. Here's my bulb, and then here's the outer perimeter of my sunflower, and then here's my leaf shape. I'm going to leave this area open so that I can write my sentiment here. So you guys get the idea? It just looks like a big giant pom-pom. And I think these are all very simple shapes that anyone can draw. We learned how to draw sunflowers in elementary school. So does anybody have any questions? All right, we're going to move on. So now what I want to do is pull out what I call my mop brush. This is the thicker of the brushes, and I am going to add some color here in the center where the center of my sunflower is, and just around my petal edges. I'm not being super careful. I'm just mopping this water in that pointed shape, and that's going to give my paper just a little bit of tooth so that my pigments can start running. I'm not going to worry about the stalks or the leaves or anything else right now. I'm just going to stay around this outer part. Now, because watercolor paper is very porous, it's cotton blend, I want to allow this this water to sort of soak into the fibers of the paper just a bit. And while it's doing that, we're going to talk about our pigments. So I'm going to pull my tray out, and I'm going to start out with my yellow, and I'm going to add quite a bit of that yellow right here because the majority of my painting has a lot of yellow in it. So I'm going to add that there. I'm going to skip a well, and I'm going to add a red. Just a drop. You don't need a whole lot of red because the red goes a long way. The pigment's very strong. And then I'm going to add some of my blue, and this is the ultramarine blue. And I'm going to add quite a bit of that as well because I'm going to use it to blend in shadow colors. And then I'm going to come back and skip a well, and I'm going to add my burnt cyan. Now, we all know how the color wheel works. These are primary colors here, and then the brown is just going to give it that richer tone and give us our tonal ranges. So I'm going to start out with, I'm not going to use my mop brush because I don't want to get it contaminated. I'm going to start out with another brush. I'm going to pick up a little bit of this yellow, and I'm going to place it here in this well, and I'm going to grab out a little bit of this red, and I'm going to mix it together. And we all know from a color wheel that we are making orange. That's basically what's happening here. But that's got a little too much pigment in it, so I'm going to wash out my brush. I don't want to contaminate my yellow at this stage. I'm going to pull out just a little bit more yellow and mix this in. So this is going to become our orange value. And there's probably way more here than we need, but that's okay. Now I'm going to also come back over here, and maybe I'll just add yellow. And I'm going to add just a little bit of this blue. Pick up some of this blue. We're going to mix that together, and that's going to make our green value. And maybe that's a little too rich, but remember these are watercolors, so as we add water to these, they become more and more translucent. So we can always add pigment to it if we need to, but the water is going to really dilute it down. So now we have a pretty green, a nice yellow, an orange, a bright red, a blue. So now let's make a purple. That's going to be our shadow colors. So we're going to pull out just a little bit of this red again, place it here. We don't need a lot of it. We're going to grab out a heaping amount of this blue, and we're going to mix it together. And notice how it's really kind of black. We've just made black. And it's really just a really deep midnight blue. And if we want this to turn a little more of a brown, we can grab out some of this burnt cyan and add it in there. And the orange just helps it take on the more black of a shadow. Okay, so now we have quite a bit of pigment going on in here. These colors are going to stay true, so I'm going to flip my palette around, and this time starting with this color because it's already on my brush, I'm going to dump some of that pigment in there, pull out some water and loosen it up. Okay, I'm going to pull out some of this and loosen it up. And I'm going to do this for all of the colors. And that's why an ice tray really helps, because it adds It gives you the opportunity to mix a bunch of different colors together. And the cool thing about this ice tray is these are watercolors. And true with all watercolors, once these dry, all you have to do is add water to them to reconstitute them. So don't throw it out. You never have to wash it. Just put it away. Okay? Does anybody have any questions so far? Now I'm going to pull quite a bit of this yellow over just because I am going to be using a lot of yellow. So I really want to make sure that my yellow has quite a bit going on in there. Grab out some of this blue, or this green, excuse me, and add a little water to that. Now another thing to keep in mind about watercolors is they go on super vibrant, but they dry very, very light. So there you go. So are we ready to begin? Cover it with saran wrap and you're done. And truthfully, once it dries out, it's not going anywhere. So something to think about. Okay, so we don't need this guy in the way. Let me put it out of the way. You guys, when I'm reaching up for colors, you can see what I'm grabbing, right? So I'm going to just go ahead and flip this around so I can see what I'm doing. Now, my palette is still, my paper is still very wet. It's very moist. And I'm going to take out my mop brush and I'm going to take my paper towel and try to keep that in frame so you guys can see it. And I'm just going to get it, let's get it, it's still kind of wet, but I'm going to grab out some of this yellow here. And I want to keep my brush very moist. And I'm just going to wash these peaks, just building out the foundation for these peaks. Now, because there is water on here, it's going to run. But everywhere my paintbrush did not leave water, it is going to pretty much stay out of those areas. And notice that I'm using the belly of my brush in my bigger areas. And because this is a real haired bristled brush and it's a cheaper model of it, it is losing some of its fibers whenever I brush over, but that's okay. As they dry, I can pick them off. But I'm using the tip of my brush to form out my sunflower petals. Okay, and don't worry about those pencil marks, because as we continue to add layers and layers of paint, those pencil marks are going to sort of disappear. So you guys see it come into life now? Does anyone have any questions? I know I'm just rambling on. Now here's the secret to watercoloring. Don't worry about your lines. Don't worry about being neat. Let the pigment do what it needs to do. Okay? Let me get that out of there. As long as I stay out, as long as I keep these perimeters dry, they won't mix. Okay? But if I start dropping water in here, then this water is going to run. So for now, let's concentrate on where we really want water. And I'm going to switch over now to my number 3 brush. And I'm going to pick up some of my orange. And this is what I'm doing. I'm just brushing that up. It's a very wet brush. And I'm just brushing it up so I'm getting some of that pigment. Okay? Now I'm going to come back and I'm just going to add a few little definitions around the petals. Realizing that the petals are going to be their darkest towards the base. The tips of sunflowers are typically very white. They're kind of a whitish yellow. So I'm just going to come in. Now some of these petals that are in the background might need a little more of the orange. Do I need to bring my camera in tighter? Are you guys good? So I'm just kind of adding some streaks. That's it. And don't overwork it. Just add a few little spots here and there, keeping in mind the orange is serving as our base for our shadows. We're going to add so many layers of paint before we're done that this is truly going to just be a base. We're going to take away and add so much more. And notice how I'm just staying right at the crest between leaves, just in a V fashion. That's all I'm doing with this paintbrush. It's a slight V. Don't worry if you go outside the lines, because there are no lines in watercolor. Like I said, it's a very organic medium and it pretty much goes where it wants to go. So we're just going to have to make it work. The beauty of it is even when it dries, we can lift color and add color as we go. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with this so far. There's lots of depth here. The wash is really starting to take shape. And ideally, that's a pretty vivid sunflower, correct? Okay, so now that we have all of this wet, let's do some negative painting. And negative painting means that I'm going to go into the areas that are, I'm going to draw to the outside to create a detail on the inside. So I hope that makes sense. Let me add a little more water to my burnt cyan because it's just a little too saturated. Now I'm going to come in and right around, using the very tip of my brush, I am going to trace around these interior petals. And the more I drag out, the more water pools up, and the pools are where the pigment lies. So we want to be very conscientious of where those are puddling up, and we want to be very aware of our brush strokes. Okay, so notice I'm coming around in a swooping fashion right here around this edge. Grab some more paint. The trick is to always keep your brush full of paint. If you're having to scrub at the paper to add pigment, then your brush is too dry. Okay, now before this has a chance to really truly dry, I'm going to add a little texture in here. And yes, it's kind of red right now, but we'll get there. So what I want to do is I'm going to take the back end of my brush and I'm just going to kind of stipple around and add some little dots. This is the therapeutic part of it. So does anybody have any questions while I do this? And these are the seeds on the sunflower. And really break these lines up coming around the edges here. You don't want a crisp line because sunflowers don't have crisp lines at the center. Okay? So now this is what we have. See it starting to come to life? Okay, so now I'm going to take my heat gun just to speed up this process a little bit, and I'm going to get it good and dry. Because remember what I said, watercolor will not bleed if it's dry. I must be explaining everything good. No one has any questions. Anybody have any comments? You guys are a quiet group tonight. Every time I paint this, it looks completely different. Like, I can never get it the same way twice. And I really truly believe it's just about practicing. And when you start, if you don't know how to do something, if you start out practicing on something that's somewhat of a small scale, then it makes it much easier for you to do what you need to do, in my opinion. So once I get this good and dry, I'm not worried about this. This is still quite wet. But I'm going to go ahead and do some negative painting here. And I'm going to pull in, I don't have a heart attack, but I'm going to pull in some of these blues. Okay? So again, I'm just going to be very specific about going around my petal shapes. Staying down my stalk. And notice how it gets lighter as I pull out. Now this brush is very dry. So I'm just going to pull a little bit, just drawing maybe an upside down V around each of these petals. And if it happens to mix a little bit, this blue with the yellow, it's okay because it'll just turn it green, which would suggest maybe a leaf or something peekabooing out. Remember, you can always add pigment or take away pigment with watercolor. It's super simple, and I'm going to show you both techniques tonight. So you're just going to mop this in, and I really should be using my mop brush for this because it's a large surface. Ooh, see how I had a lot of yellow paint on that? So I'm going to just use I need to clean my water, I think, really. But that's okay. We can use that yellow down in there. Mop up some more of this blue. Just touch that blue in. And again, using the tip of my brush to give fine detail and using the belly of my brush for the more wider surface areas. And just barely touching into these areas. I'm not adding a whole lot of pigment here, and notice how it's pulling up. That's okay. Let it drip and do its thing. We're just going to continue to work around the edges. Grabbing out more of that blue. And you want to make sure you're cleaning your brush really well before you go back to your pigment because you don't want to contaminate what you have in your wells. Okay. And it's just these little, this is so relaxing to me, guys. I could probably fall asleep doing this. How do you guys feel? Okay. And we're just negative. This is called negative painting. Negative painting. And that is because we are filling in the areas around the sunflower to help to give it shape and define its borders. That's all negative painting means. So I'm going to just kind of clean this up a little bit. Now coming back around this way, this is a huge leaf, so I'm probably going to grab some of this wash and I'm just going to kind of add some suggestions in here for a leaf. Same thing here. I'm going to pull down right here. And you know what? It might be nice to kind of suggest some leaves back over in here. Like maybe this isn't the only sunflower on in sight. Okay, now remember what I said, that as long as it's not, there's no water in this area, it won't pool up into this area. And notice that it's all pooling right here around my leaf. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take what I call a thirsty brush, and this is a very clean brush that I am going to soak all of the water off on my blotting paper, and then I'm going to use that brush to pick pigment up from my painting. And notice how that lightens it up some, and then I'm going to use that pointed tip to drag some of those puddles of water up because the water brush, because the brush is thirsty or dry, it's going to help pull out all of these puddles that we have laying around. Now see where my blue meshed in with my orange here? Don't worry about that. Just drag it out. Don't even worry about it. Now we still have a little bit of blue that we need to do. So let's come into here and add those. And if this happens to go right into my leaf, that's okay. I just want it to stay out of my yellow. My leaf I can work with, because if the blue lands in the green, of course it's no harm, no foul, because we use the blue to make the green, correct? So now I did purposely leave this open because I want to put some more yellow there, but I need this all to dry before I do that. And if you want a richer tone of blue in some spots of the wash, then just come back in with your watercolor. Let it sit for just a minute and soak up into these fibers. This paper is very much like a sponge. Allow it to sit for just a minute and puddle, and then we can come back and remove the little puddles after it's soaked into the fibers of the paper. And of course we're going to want our darkest colors around the spikes of the sunflower, because that's where the shadows would be. But you might not want all of this color down here. Now I don't want to lift this pigment up with my blotter paper, because if I do that, then it's going to lift all of the pigment up, and I want it to be very gradient. Okay, anybody have any questions? Anybody think they can't do this? I mean, seriously, this was so simple. Okay, keeping my surface clean, I'm picking that up. Now remember too that watercolor dries really a lot paler than what you're seeing right now. So I want this to sit and dry for just a minute. So while the perimeter is drying, I'm going to work on the center of my bulb just a little bit more. And I'm going to come back with this number 3 brush. And remember this sort of dark plum color that we created? We're going to come back with this color. And I'm going to go only in the darkest of areas, tracing around these petals and around the perimeter first. And I'm going to stipple this paint in some places instead of painting it in. I am using this one. This particular brush right here is a Faber-Castell brush, and I'm really liking it. To be honest with you, I am not an expert, and I haven't invested in any real quality brushes. I use the plaids. This particular mop brush that I have here is made by Artist Loft, and I don't really care for it. I'll be honest with you. It's a number 8. I don't care for it because the fibers pull out of it. If this is something you think you are going to do a lot, then I highly recommend investing in some good quality brushes. For those of you who've been following me around, you know that I have a terrible, terrible habit of abusing my brushes. So I haven't invested really in some quality brushes. I hope that answers your question. I haven't tried. I use mostly the plaid brushes, and I believe that this is a synthetic hair brush. It's a Faber-Castell, but it's made to work with watercolors, and I like it a lot. And I'm taking my time here adding stipples around. And also notice I'm not holding my brush way down here, okay? Because if I hold it here, I'm going to get a really tight, almost handwriting effect. If I hold it mid-barrel of the brush, then I have a little more play in the brush, and it's not a death grip. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm being a little more loose when I hold the brush way back here. And by adding these little stipples of paint, I'm adding texture to my watercolor without a whole lot of detail. Now sunflowers typically have a ridge of lighter color and then a darker spot in the center. So I'm just doing this. Now my brush has become quite dry, so as I stipple, it's picking up some of that burnt cyan from below. And look at the texture I'm getting without adding any more pigment. I'm actually lifting pigment off of the paper and adding it back to the paper in other areas because it's being lifted up into the brush. So which brushes do you prefer, Elizabeth? What's your favorite watercolor brand? Okay, so there we go. You guys like it so far? Now it's time to add a few details. And like I said, I really want, this is kind of dry right in here. So I really want to add a little more yellow here because I noticed that I just feel like the petals would come down in front like this. All right, now let's give a little more substance to our leaf. And to do that, we're going to grab out some more of this plum, and I'm going to kind of paint in here a little shadow, staying on one side of the leaf because the bulb, the light's probably going to come from this direction actually, but this leaf is kind of coming out through here. So I want to kind of add a little texture there, and I think it's really cool when the leaf itself has a little touch of purple in it and a little touch of crimson in it. So I'm going to pull out some of these colors. It just gives some nice crispness to the leaf. Now remember, we can take color away with a thirsty brush, but I'm going to take some more of this green and I'm just going to brush through. And now look at how all of these different colors mix together and make up this really beautiful plum color. Isn't that cool? And now I can take the back of my brush and just kind of scratch into this some veins for my petal, for my leaves. Now you won't see them right now, but trust me, they will sort of magically appear in just a moment. So now I've got my brush good and clean, and I'm going to use that negative painting, remember, I mean not negative painting, the thirsty brush technique to pick up some of that color. And then I'm going to come back with another touch of this green. This is the dark green, and I'm going to just place a little more of a shadow right through here. And I'm going to let that sit. We can always come back and work on it more later, but we don't want to overwork it right now because everything will turn to mud. But see how the veining just sort of showed up? Let me hit it with the heat gun. See how that veining just kind of showed up? So now it's time to put a few more details there in our flowers. So let's get this good and dry. And then we're going to come back with our number 3 brush again. This is my favorite one, I think. I'm going to pull up a lot of this orange. I'm going to pull this in so you can see it. This orange here. And I have an empty well over here, so I'm going to dump some of that over in here. And then I'm going to grab out some more of this yellow because I want this to really be yellow, but I want it to have more of a medium tone to it. Maybe just a little more. That crimson is so rich, it goes a long way. So now I'm going to come back, and this is where my petal shapes are really going to start taking shape. In a feathery wisp, I'm going to just kind of follow my pencil traces around some of these petals. And I'm just flicking it out. I'm not really making a petal shape per se. I'm just flicking color out and around. And don't be afraid if you need to. Don't be afraid to turn your paper. But see how that's going to start. And I want this to pull up, which is why we're not using a watercolor palette. We're using these full-bodied watercolors because we want the texture that comes from that thicker paint. And the more layers we add, the thicker it is, the more realistic our leaves become. Remember that our sunflowers are going to be the lightest towards the tip. I have a little trick for that at the very end. And we want to flick some of that color going back this way. And I'm going to paint just a very thin ridge right in here. See, there's one of the hairs from my mopped up. That's why I don't like that too much. Okay, we're going to grab out some more of this paint and then just continue to build out, starting with the leaves that are more towards the back and then come back over the top. And it looks like I might need to make up a little more of this paint. I may actually have to go and squirt some more of this paint in here. Oops, it might have been too much. It is way too much. It's okay. There's a trick for that too. It's called add more paint. Does anybody have any questions? And notice I'm not really adding a whole lot of water to this, just enough to where my brush can move freely, but it's still pretty thick on my brush. See, it's really thick because I really want that texture as I smash these leaves in, and I'm pulling them out towards the outer petals. The trick here is lots of paint. A lot of paint. No, maybe not that much paint. Remember that my petals are going to be their darkest towards the base or the back. And I'm letting the shape of the brush really dictate the shape of the petal, which is why I chose a sunflower for this, because with these round brushes it's so easy to create this look. I mean, look at the difference already just between the top versus this bottom area. We have a lot of texture going on there. Hold on, Anne-Marie, I'll mod you again. Okay, you're modded. So does anybody have any questions? And like I said, don't forget to turn your paper so that you're pulling towards yourself. Or actually, you want to be pulling away from yourself. That's really a better way to say it. Because you want that flick to come out to a point. A lot of paint on my brush. Start at the base, keeping those tips kind of out of the, you don't cover the whole surface because you want layers of color, if that makes sense. Now look at our paint, our sunflower. Isn't it cool? Let's come back in while this is drying and maybe help with a little bit of water to soften up some of these areas. Just kind of helps it to blend. Not a lot, don't add a lot of water. We don't want a lot of drippage going on here. But let's go ahead and hit this with the heat gun. Anybody got any questions? We're really getting there. It's almost done. I think I want this area to be a little darker. So that's where my purple's really going to come in. And while I'm doing this, I think I'm going to take some of this blue and mix it back up again with a little bit of this crimson. I don't need a lot, but I want a really nice violet color going on here. Because that makes a really, really cool shadow. The crimson does. With the ultraviolet blue. Okay, so let's turn this off. We've got this area dry, which is what we wanted. Now it's time to come back in and add some of those shadows back, like I said. And this is where our negative painting comes in. We're going to just kind of follow along right at the base, only at the bottom of our sunflower. See how it's helping to define these shapes? But if the sun's coming down on it, this is going to be the shadowed areas right in here. I hear Boo at the door. She wants to come in. Now to soften these edges up just a bit because they are a bit harsh, I'm going to come back in with the blue. Just this is the light blue that we've mixed up here. And I'm going to drop some of this down in here and just wash it out. So you can see how just adding some water helps to soften that rich tone that we have created. And it helps to get rid of some of those really harsh lines. And I think we need to add a little bit of blue right in here and maybe a little on this side of the stalk. And if you think you've added too much purple, like this has just become a huge black eye, all you have to do is remember that thirsty brush. Just bring that brush over, dry it off, and pick up pigment. And see how that's blended out now? Just drop some water in and let the water just do its thing. Think of water, when water added like this is like an eraser. But it's leaving behind a really, really nice shadow. And we really have very little effort in it. And again, just come back with a really thirsty brush and pick the pigment up. And remember too that this is going to dry a lot lighter than what you're seeing here because that's the nature of watercolor. The hairs, they drive me nuts. It will when it dries, you will be able to pick those off too. Okay. In the meantime, I've made this lovely little line. Okay, does anybody have any questions? We're just about done here. I really think that after looking at this and giving that a little bit of time to dry, I want to come back with some of this purple and add just a little more of a shadow into some of these areas. And again, just dibbling it around. Who would have thought purple would look so great, right? Look at that purple and how natural it just looks. And then if you want to really just get it to looking more natural, just stipple it in there like that with your paintbrush and pick up some of that texture. And don't forget to hold your brush deep. And I'm just going to stay to the darker regions of this. And then we're going to come back with a little bit of the yellow and just drop some of that down in there too. That's going to offer us a little bit of a highlight. Know when to say when. Figuring this top part of the leaf is kind of shadowed a little bit by the bulb of the sunflower. Now I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to come back with my yellow and just kind of flick some color back into these areas just to smooth this out a little bit. Adding some water, allow it to drip. Remember, this is watercolor and it's very impressionistic. And allow it to be organic. Don't overwork it. It's not acrylic. Don't overwork it. Allow the colors to blend. Allow the colors to do their thing. You'll be surprised at the very end. Right now it might look like a hot mess, and then after it dries you're like, wow, I did that. It's okay if it's not perfect because it's watercolor. But look at how beautiful that is. I mean, seriously, does it get any better than that? Oh, it is easy, Pam. It is easy. Okay, I'm going to dry this real quick and I'm going to kind of read through the chat a little bit. So you have problems with shading. Here's the trick. Here's a trick I learned with shading. Every time you have something dark, you're going to have something light next to it. Okay? So the shadow, think of it like this. If you were to buy a sunflower, put it in a vase, stick the light in the upper right hand corner, and take a note at where the shadows fall. When you add these streaks of this orange, it kind of gives you that impression that there is a petal on top of a petal. Does that make sense? And if you allow this to dry, then you'll still get all of that rich, luscious texture from the thickness of the paint. And that offers a little bit of a hint as to where the shadows would be too. Remember, if my sun is coming from this direction, this is typically going to be shadowed by these leaves that are pulled forward, or these petals that are pulled forward. This is going to be somewhat protected from the sun, so it's going to be a little more shadowed. Just because these, you're not seeing them three-dimensional, but these right here would be kind of casted out three-dimensional, like fingers like this. So this area would be a little more shadowed, but you would still see some of these highlights because of the gap between these petals. Does that make sense? And then down at the base you would have more shadowing here because the sun is this big huge sunflower is blocking the sun over the leaf. So the leaf, the sun direction, if it's coming from here, the bottom of the leaf is actually going to have more light than the top of the leaf because the bulb is casting a shadow over the top of the leaf. Does that make sense? Does that help? Have I used the Corey watercolor brushes? No, but I really want the Corey watercolor paints. So I'm quite certain that those brushes are going to be fabulous. No, I have not. I can tell you I do have water brushes here that have water in the barrel of the paintbrush, but I don't recommend them for this technique because they dump way too much water. Now after this is dry, I've noticed that this is just a little too harsh, so with the magic of watercolor, all I have to do is come back with a wet brush and see how I just pick that little bit off. That's it. It's so simple. Now, one final thing that I really want to do. I want to show you guys how to do it. At the very tips of these petals, it's just a little too orange for me. So I'm going to take my number 3 with a lot of water, and I'm just going to touch that water right on a dry card now. I'm going to touch it right at the tips of these sunflowers. And I'm going to let it sit there for just a minute. And I'm just going to tip just at the very tips. I'm not going to do it all over, just at the very tips. I'm going to show you some magic. Just at the very tips, because remember when I told you the tips of these sunflowers are going to be bright yellow. So I'm just touching right at the tips in some strategic places. Not all over, just in some strategic places. Now, that water has pooled up, and do you remember our thirsty brush? And my paper towel has gotten a little too moist, so let me grab another one out. So remember our thirsty brush. So we're going to get this brush good and dry, and I want these shapes to be sort of like the petal, and I'm just going to pick up some of this pigment. And when I do this, see how bright my tip has gotten? Just pick it up. All we're doing is picking up pigment. We're letting the brush soak up the pigment. And I really believe it is these fine details that make everything magical. And you're just going to pick up all of that liquid that we've laid down. See how it's lifting up the pigment? And it's bringing that petal back down to its lighter state and really defining it a little more. Did you see that? Tell me if you understood what happened. So we're just going to drop a little bit of paint right here, just at the very cusp of where those tips are. Let the water soak into the fibers of the paper. Then we're going to come back with a very thirsty brush, which means it's very dry. Mold the shape of the petal and then pick up the pigment. See how bright that leaf got? Let me see if I can get it to focus. See how bright that got right there? And if I drag that back in here to smooth it out, do you see how bright that leaf got? We'll do it here so you can see it up close. All we're doing is lifting that pigment. And then right where it just doesn't look like it's quite blended very well, we're just going to push some of that orange back up to blend it out. Do you see that? Look right here. Lift the pigment and then push the orange through to blend. Lift the pigment and then push some of the orange through to blend it out. Lift Boo, stop it. My dog is scratching at the door. Daddy just got her. But now do you see how the tips of my sunflower just came to life? How cool is that? I know you guys can do this. I know you can do it. Right here, let's try it right here. We're just going to put a little bit of water right there. Let it sit for just a minute. Put a little bit there. Maybe a little bit on this one. Get a really thirsty brush and lift that water up. Pulling it down. If you're using white watercolor paint, you're cheating. This is how you get white. This is how you get highlights. Look at that. See how it's just kind of added that ridge of depth back to my petals? I think we're done. What do you guys think? Your dog is snorting next to you like a drunken sailor. Mine is huffing and puffing at the door, but her daddy heard me say that and he called her back. And look at this. Every time I do it, it looks completely different. Completely. But isn't that cool? I just get better at it, I think, more than anything. Okay, so now let's get this dry so we can do our hand lettering on it. And we can call it done. Does anybody have any questions? I mean, I'm seriously thinking I can do this on a canvas now. I mean, what's holding me back, right? You see how long it takes. We've been in here for an hour and 10 minutes. And it was super simple. And I think the trick is truly paint. It's the thickness of the paint. It's knowing how watercolors work. It's knowing your primary colors and how shadows work. I mean, I could probably even continue. Let's just make a big mess out of everything. Come back, add a little more of this yellow, and do that same technique that we did with the orange. And come back and just add some of these of the yellow. I don't think it's necessary, but it does add a little texture, you know, a little more texture. And this is how, I know you guys have seen watercolor paintings before that had a lot of texture, and you're like, how do they do that? It's just a lot of paint on a brush. I mean, seriously, that's all it is. I mean, I'm sure they're mixing it with other mediums to give the texture, but for a card, you know, keep it simple. Don't overthink it. It's just brush strokes, and most of the time, I would say probably most of the time, if you're struggling with something, drawing something, it's because you're not using the right tools. And if you think it's the brush, switch brushes. If you think it's the paint, switch paint. But see how that gives it just that nice little hint of fire? Oh, I'm so in love with this. Okay, so while that paint up there dries really well, because I don't really want it to be super. Let's talk about hand lettering for a second. I have really, really fallen in love with hand lettering. Like, this is my new favorite thing in the world, is to hand letter. I will probably never buy a sentiment stamp again. But if you are not super great at it and you don't want to slap it right down on your card, always, you know, go. There's plenty of stamps out there that you could use at this point. I just prefer the look of the hand lettering. If I'm going to go through the trouble of hand coloring something, I'm going to hand letter something. Does that make sense? So you guys like? Okay, now to give this even more texture, or just a little more love, I've got my vintage photo distress ink. I think I just got the hiccups. And carefully, because this is all still very wet, I'm just going to kind of burnish the edges of this card. And it's a little detail, but it adds a little border. It just sort of finishes it out. And gives it a really nice country feel, autumn feel. And it helps to mask some of that white core of the paper. Isn't that cool? And then if you really want to darken it up a little bit, you can always just, I don't want to do too much because my sunflower is still sort of wet in here. So let's go ahead and do our hand lettering. I am going to use, this is an Impact 207 Uniball Signo pen. Love this pen. It writes over gelatos. If you have not got this in your life, you need it in your life if you're a mixed media artist. And I mean, here's an example. These are gelatos that I just was practicing. And for those of you who use gelatos, you know what I mean. Nothing writes over them. Look at that. So, with that said, you do want to scribble off to the side a little bit because the gelatos have a waxy film on them, so you don't want that on there. So what I'm going to try and do is I want to write the word birthday first because I want my happy to be somewhat centered over the birthday. And when I look at the word birthday, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 letters. So the fourth letter needs to be somewhat centered on the card. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's going to be my T. So I want my T to be somewhere around here. Okay. Now, here's the tricky part. It's going to be maybe, let's put the B here. Well, I just messed that up, didn't I? I went too far, but that's okay. So now what I can do to fill in this gap is I can make my T a little bigger. And make my R a little thicker. And you always want to make your downstrokes a little broader. When you're hand lettering. There you go. Happy birthday. And then this is still not quite dry yet, but I'm going to try and be super careful with it. I have a card here that I'm going to stick this on. These are already cut to A2. I take my scraps and I always cut them down to A2 size so I can use them for cards. So make sure this is good and dry. And I have my foam adhesive here. And I think because this is wet, I don't want to just flip it upside down. So I'm going to be very careful here. And just add, let's see, nothing like trying to cut upside down. That doesn't work ever for anyone, right? Sorry for the camera going in and out of focus. I'll get it in just a second. I just don't want to lay my card down because it will be now. Remember what I said. Nothing's wasted in this this ice cube bowl, because we can I just see a little bit of cleanup I need to do right here. We can let that dry out and it'll be fine. I can add water to it and it will all come to life again. Okay, so here's my card panel. And before I put this down, I want to do something to the inside here of my card. Let me add a little bit of, I have some more, this is not watercolor paper. Instead it is a just cardstock. So I'm going to take that same distress ink because it's too bright, it's too white. So I'm just going to kind of come around the edges here, darken this up a little bit. Take my ATG tape. And you may want to paint another sunflower here on the center, but because of time restraints, I'm not going to. I can do that. Make sure you put it down straight. I can do that whenever I am getting ready to do my card or send it off or whatever. So this is actually cut to, I guess it's 11, scored at 5.5 by 4 1/4. Then I'm going to take this. And you know, you could add ribbon to this too if you wanted to just give it something a little softer. But I like being able to mail these because they're flat. And there you go. There's our finished card. Now, how gorgeous, giving you guys a tip, how gorgeous would this be to make up a whole set of these, like maybe 12 of them, 10 or 12. So I already have 2 here, really 3, because I shared with you guys this one that I did earlier today that I may do a YouTube video on. So how gorgeous would it be for me to give these as a set to a coworker, Sunday school teacher, a school teacher, maybe one of your kids' teachers, as a Christmas gift. Because who doesn't need a thank you card or a happy birthday card at some point in their life? And if you do a special gift instead of happy birthday, if you use that sentiment, then you could use it as a thank you or as a happy birthday. You know, so there's some thoughts on a great gift idea for Christmas coming up. You've got plenty of time to work on them and knock some of these out. I mean, just how gorgeous is this? I mean, who wouldn't love to get a set like this to give? And you know what? For me, I feel like there are a lot of people I like to give little things to that don't cost me a whole lot of money. What does this cost me? A little bit of paint and a little bit of paper, but a whole lot of my time. And it's a fabulous gift idea. I mean, just a fabulous, and you could make a whole different set of them. They don't all have to be sunflowers. You can make some that are spring, some that are winter, some that are more fall. But who wouldn't love to give this as a gift, or receive this as a gift and then be able to give it to someone else? So just a little thought. I know we're heading into the holiday season and sometimes it's super stressful, and some of us are on a very limited budget, and this is a way we can give a gift to someone too. So um, thank you guys so much for coming and hanging out with me tonight, and for hanging. I know it was a holiday for those here in the United States, so I know it was a bit of a challenge getting here, but it is recorded for those of you who missed it. I hope I taught you a few things about watercolor and eliminated some of your fears. Thank you to Anne Marie Colbert for moderating for me tonight. I really appreciate it. She's a very good friend of mine, super talented. Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Sharon. And welcome to my channel, Elizabeth, and it was great to meet you. Oh, and here's a sneak peek at one that I'm going to do on my YouTube later on this month too. It's a little harder to see because it's a little more pastel. So look for this on my YouTube. For those of you who are new, cyclemoms.com, and you can get to all my social media outlets. If you decide to create something that I showed you how to do tonight, please hashtag following Tonya Gibbs on Instagram and Twitter so that I can find it. I would love to be able to see what you guys are creating based on the techniques that I share with you. As always, some of you have even done this. Or tag me on Facebook if you happen to create something based on tonight's class. Tag me on Facebook. Good night, everyone.